Imagine it's the World Cup and nobody knows. And this is exactly the position we find ourselves in, even though nobody is a little bit of an exaggeration, I have to agree. But upon viewing this subreddit, at the point of this recording, the most highly operated thread currently is the following one. It's called, "Is it me or is the World Cup hardly being promoted?" And the top comment also talks about that this user, Daddy Aries, is highly confused because he thought the World Cup is going to start in September or October of this year. Not a bad assumption considering it's much closer to BlizzCon. And then other users ask as well. And we find us in the situation that the first stop in South Korea, in Incheon, is in merely 3 days upon this recording. Now, this obviously raises a couple of issues of promotion, but I think there's a general underpinning issue with the World Cup in general, which I hope to sort of address and then also change in how we perceive it. Because in my opinion, it is time to take the Overwatch World Cup much more seriously than we did in the past. Now, this is rich coming from someone like me, who on several podcasts expressed that he wasn't exactly smitten with the idea of the World Cup. And there's a couple of reasons as to why one shouldn't be taking this seriously. Obviously, the underlying notion of the concept of the World Cup is that you don't really have people who have practiced an extensive amount of time with each other. And it's more like a best selection. And some countries don't have a full set of 6 players that are world class. Unlike, for instance, hopefully Overwatch League teams would be. And then the Overwatch League teams also get to practice the entire year and whatever. Obviously, the selection process in that is problematic in comparison to what, top Overwatch seems to look like. Then it's obviously also that in the past, players have expressed that they basically drove to the World Cup and to these qualifying tournaments without having actually scrimmed much at all, maybe a day or two. So the players themselves don't really care about the Overwatch World Cup as much as I think they should be. And it's also a little bit problematic if you think about it. The internet culture sort of moves away from nationality and from the tribalistic notion of togetherness of a nation, even though it's very much still part of everyone in some sense. I would assume that there's some connection to the birthplace you're coming from. But certainly that seems to be less expressed in internet communities who are used to connecting with people all over the world and have learned, for instance, to cherish these Korean players and whatever. And I don't think that's a particularly strong bond as it is for the average human who then, for instance, as the Soccer World Cup shows, feels a very strong bond. I don't want to downplay that too much because I think there's definitely proof of concept that it still very much exists, just a little bit less so in internet culture. Also, you have to say that the incentive structure for the World Cup isn't really geared towards anything but playing for the sake of playing a good game, for fame, and I guess for national pride. Because this incentive structure in the World Cup isn't, for instance, driven by prize money whatsoever. Every player gets the same amount, gets a hotel and obviously a stay at BlizzCon if they make it there, which I suppose is a goal. But once you're there, there's not really a systematic incentive for these players to care overly much. Now, with all these reasons given, while previously people didn't have to care for the Overwatch World Cup, I now came to the conclusion that I personally, and therefore also others, I want to care about it and I want to influence others because of the thought processes I've been going through, and maybe this will convince you as well. Now, the first glaringly obvious problem or reason we have for taking the Overwatch World Cup seriously is that the current off-season, despite the Overwatch League, is very, very long. So we are looking at, I think, if we exclude the preseason, which I don't think should really be part of the equation of the Overwatch League. Obviously, yes, it builds a little bit high, but it's not really, straight competition, and I don't think we can expect players to try their hardest in there. Could argue that there could be some sort of cup before this season, but this is a different topic. But we have some month to get over, and so far we only know of the Overwatch World Cup and the All-Stars game that fills that void, that need for competitive Overwatch to be taken seriously. So just because we didn't have or don't have any other off-season tournaments, that in itself already suggests that the Overwatch World Cup needs to be taken seriously, because what are we going to do? Doing nothing for 5 months? That doesn't seem like a practical application of Overwatch as an esport. It is also not in the interest of the player to do just that, because certainly contenders players have a chance to still show what they can do in the contender seasons, who are playing a little bit more during the off season, in the sense that they don't completely take a break. But it is also for the Overwatch League talent and the players at the World Cup themselves that need to suggest themselves. So let me give a couple of anecdotes to show you just how important the Overwatch World Cup was for finding these players and finding hidden talent to a degree that otherwise would have likely not resulted in the same situation. Now, the glaringly obvious example is obviously EQO, isn't it? EQO is an Israeli player who was playing on a tier 3 team, was sort of known from solo queue, but not really, and I don't think anyone who's honest about their predictability of Overwatch talent was really singing high praises of this guy before the World Cup happened. At the World Cup, and I don't think we can overestimate that very fact at all, is Overwatch League GMs and coaches are present, meaning that you get to meet these people and also connect on a human basis. And definitely people who work in business know if you meet people in person, there's a special, not only bond that sort of is created in this relationship between you, which probably wouldn't happen online, but is also that people get to see you in a real world environment they would then work with you under if it comes to the being recruited for an Overwatch League team. And it's also the case that we found out over the season that coachability is one of the more important aspects of an Overwatch League player. Now, how do you test coachability? Is probably either you have an extensive amount of scrims and then judge a player by, but these intangible factors you will never find out if you don't give this guy a scrim. And why would you give EQO one unless you've seen extensive footage of him? It's much like an application that falls through the stacks, that never sees the eye of the HR because it's not extraordinary, or you don't have a direct connection to them. And obviously if you have a relative that sort of connects to you, or if you show up at their door, shake their hand, it's obviously that this relationship immediately becomes a bit different. So what I have no background about this, but I very strongly believe or guess that it's unlikely we would see EQO in the Overwatch League if he doesn't show up at that World Cup, possibly connects to Kirby or whatever, or talks into some other guys, and then those GMs talk to each other, and one guy's like, ah, well, I have already a project I play, but if you need one, this guy's pretty good. This happens too, right? So also having the other players recommend you. Oh, I was out with this guy, he was highly skilled, I had really trouble in the game, and then we also hung out in the lobby of the hotel later on, and he seems like a decent dude, maybe we could take a look at him. This all happens. It's arguable if that should be like a really, significant portion of the recruitment, but it is pretty much in all of human life, isn't it? And to a lesser degree, I guess in sports, you have these metrics and these performance metrics where it's less so. We don't have that in Overwatch as much yet, do we? So, another player recently, for instance, Coolmat said that the World Cup the year before, he wouldn't have probably been discovered as much. And now, obviously, he had at least stage 1. He was considered one of the best divas in the game. Also, with FNR GFE, that helped him to get onto that team, his reputation from the World Cup. Then also keep in mind, this guy used to be a DPS player. So the transition, it's not a given that this guy is then considered for these roles, right? He, in an interview, said that he believes without the World Cup, it's unlikely he would have been put back on the map and would have hit the Overwatch League. Now it happened. So, for players, there's no reason not to take this Overwatch World Cup seriously if you're the slightest bit fearing either to not be signed by an Overwatch League team or to not have your contract, well, transferred, really, right? But so if you're, for instance, a player of an underperforming team, you still could be transitioning to a new team, to an expansion slot team, if people get to know you there. And we know at BlizzCon, for instance, that there are mixes, that there are these people. You can network yourself into an Overwatch League position. Now, this isn't anything about the highly competitive aspect and the parts I like about the competition, meaning that I want to see excellence from these players, and I want to see people take this seriously. But this is the reality of human life, and I have to concede this is a reality, and Overwatch League players should not trick themselves into thinking that this is an off-season game where they can relax. If you took the duty of playing for your country, you should give it your all. You should be practicing right now, and you should be trying to beat the Koreans. Now, it's also, I don't quite like the defeatist attitude of some of these teams who previously went to the World Cup and went like, well, the Koreans are not going to drop a map. Why try? Well, why not? And even if you are of that belief, then this Overwatch League season with, for instance, Philadelphia Fusion, with only a couple of Koreans getting to the final, and let's not forget, most of the season was played without their frontline being Korean. This definitely proved the concept of Westerners being able to perform on a world stage, doesn't it? So, even more so, we saw the impact of metas that they can have. And if you're there, and if you're on form, why would it not be the case that, especially now that we have NYXL and Valiant players predominantly in that roster, that they could be underperforming and you could be taking the World Cup home? They aren't untouchable gods anymore, which, by the way, also the series once again against Runaway proves. Obviously, Runaway today just took the series in a close one, closer than last year when Element Mystic, who we now know is a very solid team in the Korean region, took them 3-0, the team. So there's definitely precedent of these people not being unbeatable. But also, I have to say, from what I know, the South Koreans themselves took it very seriously. Because for them, it is about pride. It is about playing for their country. And it is about showing good games. Because there's a responsibility of pro players of that profession, deeply rooted into South Korean gamer culture, to show good games for fans. Because they're appreciative. Of course, also, we have to say, why not take the World Cup seriously when we have the proof of concept being that the Football World Cup is the biggest sporting event in the world, and I dare say is probably the most united entity or endeavor we as a human race hugely partake in a fairly frequent basis. All continents are engaged in that. And now increasingly America is also coming to the table in football, and they're all doing it for national pride. It has huge viewership. The proof of concept is all there. Make no mistake, this works, right? Even though I already mentioned that nationality is obviously possibly not as big among gamers or among netizens, it is definitely still a huge appeal. And if you look at threads about this in the competitive Overwatch subreddit, I think the connection is still very much there between people in their countries. Even though, well, personally for me, I don't quite share that, but I definitely am not mute to the reality of what the emotional landscape is for many people. Well, I guess this leads us nicely into a huge nuisance, and I guess I want to close with that. I have to say that despite Australia and one other country, which I currently can't name, is that I'm hugely disappointed in every single community content creator that was voted into that position that we have at the World Cup so far, especially those that will compete in South Korea, which is the first stop. We haven't seen any content from you guys. You have been voted in to that position, so you've gained the confidence of your fellow countrymen to promote the team, to promote what you stand for, to share the ideas of these players, to have a couple of feature pieces on them, have a couple of interviews, build up the hype of that. And we haven't seen anything but tweets, to my knowledge. And sorry to those that I've overseen. It's entirely possible that especially some of the non-English-speaking countries didn't have their content on Reddit or on the Twitter feeds I subscribe to. In that case, obviously, this call-out is not towards you. But definitely for all the other community leads, it is honestly very disappointing that we haven't seen any hype at all. Because part of taking it seriously is leading and having the media create a narrative that is serious. So, as media people, we have to take the responsibility in order to tell the stories. It is not that we need to make up these stories. Because, once again, as I've already mentioned with EKO, there are these stories. There are these huge success stories that make a player's career and definitely tremendously change their lives in terms of how their future will continue as a player. So, why do we not see these pieces? And let's not forget, these people get flown out to these specific locations. They receive... I'm not sure if they receive a payment for that. I don't really care for that. They signed up under the condition that they would be creating content. It is my understanding that they haven't received specific guidelines from Blizzard. But I would strongly suggest for Blizzard to have in the guidelines, before you accept a position for community lead, that you agree to a certain quantity and quality of content that will eventually hit the social media outlets such as Reddit. And there's also a huge craving for that kind of content. It is honestly... Yes, let me say, it's a disgrace that we are in a position where people don't know that their squad will be playing, and you all drop the ball on this one. I'm sorry I have to be this harsh, but it's honestly, I've said it also for the Overwatch League, that this is a situation where we still hadn't had big feature pieces on all the finals participating players. At least there was something, and it is not only on Blizzard to create the narratives that will lead up to the World Cup. They have already systematically created that position that should be making that work. They are paying you for that. It is not there to freeload a trip to BlizzCon if your team performs well, which most of the time the community lead has no influence on, because it's not the general manager. They don't schedule scrims or whatever. They're exclusively there to create content. That doesn't influence the level of play. So by not creating content, your team then making it to the Overwatch Rail Club, you're freeloading to BlizzCon. I have to say it this harshly, because that's how I see it. Once again, if you're one of those community leads that has created content, I don't have any quibbles with you. I hope I made my point. Thanks for watching.